The courtroom was eerily quiet as Jessica Harrow stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The long, drawn-out trial had already taken its toll on everyone present. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension almost tangible. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what. And then, she entered. Jessica. The once perfect wife of millionaire businessman Victor Harrow. She was dressed in black, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek bun. Her face was calm, almost too calm, betraying no hint of the emotional turmoil she had been carrying for months. It was as though the woman who had once been the picture of elegance and poise had now become something else entirely. Her eyes, however, told a different story, eyes that burned with a quiet fury, a simmering anger that only someone who had been wronged to her core could possess. Victor Harrow, seated in the front row, barely flinched when he saw her. He was used to her being around, of course. They had been married for over 20 years. But today was different. Today, everything would change. He knew it. The mistress. Jenna. She was sitting beside Victor, her fingers nervously twisting a silver bracelet on her wrist. Her eyes, however, were not filled with fear, at least, not yet. She had been by Victor's side throughout this entire ordeal. The two of them had conspired together, crafting a narrative that would absolve them of any wrongdoing. They had thought they were in control, that the truth would never come out. They were wrong. Jessica's step faltered for just a moment as she approached the witness stand. Her gaze swept across the room, settling for a brief second on the faces of the reporters in the back. Her heart was pounding, but there was no turning back now. The truth was about to be revealed. She climbed into the stand with ease, the polished wood creaking beneath her weight. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. No emotion, no hesitation. Not anymore. The judge called for order, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "Miss Harrow, you may proceed," he said, his voice calm, neutral. Jessica nodded, glancing briefly at Victor. His face was pale, his lips pressed tightly together. He was trying to maintain his composure, but she could see the cracks. Jenna, on the other hand, was focused on her, glaring at her, as though daring her to say something that would destroy the carefully constructed world they had built. But Jessica wasn't interested in games anymore. She had been living in a world of lies for too long. It was time for the truth to be spoken. "I know what you've been doing," Jessica began, her voice low but filled with certainty. Her words echoed throughout the courtroom, sending a ripple through the crowd. "And you're about to find out just how much I know." Victor's eyes widened, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed vulnerable. His shoulders slumped slightly, as though a heavy weight had just been placed upon them. Jenna shot him a quick glance, her face now filled with concern. Jessica continued, her gaze never leaving her husband's. "You think you've outsmarted me, Victor. You thought you could hide your affair, that you could make me believe your lies. But the truth is, I knew long before you ever thought I would." The room fell silent. The reporters, who had been scribbling furiously in their notebooks, paused, as though they too could sense the gravity of the moment. Victor tried to compose himself, but his fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the chair. He looked at Jenna, and then back at Jessica. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Jenna muttered, her voice laced with irritation. "But you're not going to get away with this." Jessica didn't react. She was beyond caring about Jenna's snide comments. She had far more important things to deal with now. A sudden realization washed over her. This wasn't just about exposing Victor's betrayal. It was about her reclaiming her own power, her own story. All the years she had spent in the shadows, playing the dutiful wife, staying silent, had led her here. It had all been leading to this moment. The lawyer for the defense, who had been standing quietly by, motioned for the witness to step forward. Jessica turned her gaze to the door, her heart racing. The witness. It had taken everything in Jessica to track down this person, someone who had been there from the beginning. Someone who had witnessed everything firsthand. The truth was buried deep, but now, with the right person on her side, it was about to be unearthed. The witness emerged, walking slowly toward the stand. It was a woman, mid-30s, with long, dark hair and a steely expression. She had been the one person who knew the full extent of Victor's deception. "I knew Jessica before any of this happened," the witness said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I was there when she first started noticing the signs. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the strange phone calls. She didn't want to believe it at first. She loved her husband. But then she found the letter." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. His face turned an even darker shade of pale. His eyes flickered nervously between the witness and Jessica. The letter, the witness continued, was the turning point. "It was something that Jessica never told anyone about. But I was there when she found it. And that was when she knew. That was when everything changed." Victor's jaw clenched. He had thought the letter was long gone, destroyed, burned. He had been wrong. You never told anyone about it," the witness said, turning to Jessica. "You kept it hidden. You waited. You knew that if you exposed the truth too soon, it would all fall apart. So you let them think they had the upper hand, while you prepared for the right moment." Jessica nodded slowly, a flicker of pain in her eyes. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but what other choice did she have? Victor and Jenna were sitting frozen now, their eyes wide with disbelief. Jessica turned her gaze back to Victor, her voice steady, yet filled with a deep sadness. "I loved you, Victor. But you never loved me. You never cared about me. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences." A chill ran through the courtroom. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. But Jessica wasn't finished yet. There was more to this story. Much more. The witness was about to reveal something even more shocking. Something that would shake Victor to his core. "You see," the witness said, pausing for a moment, "there's something else. Something you didn't know, Victor. While you were busy with your affair, Jessica was building something of her own. She had a plan all along." Victor's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The witness didn't respond right away. She only looked at Jessica with a knowing glance, as though the two women were sharing some unspoken understanding. Jessica took a deep breath, preparing herself for the next revelation. "I knew everything, Victor. I knew about the affair, the lies, the secrets you thought you had buried. But what you didn't know was that I was setting a trap of my own." Victor's face went pale. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The trap was set. And it was time for Victor and Jenna to face the consequences of their actions. Jessica's story was just beginning. Victor Harrow's heart pounded in his chest as Jessica's words echoed in his mind. The courtroom had descended into chaos, but he barely heard the shuffling of papers, the murmurs of disbelief, or the gasp of surprise from those in attendance. All he could focus on was her, his wife, standing so tall, so strong, so defiant. How had she known? And more importantly, what was the trap she had set for him? Jenna, sitting beside him, was no better. Her face had drained of color, and her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She reached over to grip Victor's hand, but he yanked it away violently, unable to process what was happening. Jessica's gaze lingered on Victor for just a moment longer before she turned back to the witness stand, where the woman stood, tall, composed, and seemingly unfazed by the storm she had just unleashed. The witness had played her part well, but now, the truth was becoming clearer. And it wasn't just about the affair anymore. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, it all went deeper. Much deeper. Victor's mind raced, trying to piece together how this had all started. What had she discovered? What had she been planning? All his life, he had been the one in control, the one who pulled the strings. But now? Now, he was the one being pulled in every direction. Jessica had always been observant, but he had never imagined that she would go so far as to investigate the deepest corners of his life. He had thought he could get away with it. After all, he had money, power, influence. What was a little affair in the grand scheme of things? But Jessica had never been just a passive bystander. She had always been sharp, always had a hidden layer beneath the polished exterior. A layer he had never bothered to understand. "Jessica," Victor said finally, his voice tight. "What do you want?" Her expression softened for just a moment, but the coolness in her gaze never wavered. "What do I want? I want the truth to come out, Victor. I want everyone to know who you really are. Not the charming businessman, not the man with a heart of gold, not the doting husband. No. I want them to know the liar, the cheat, the man who thought he could play with people's lives without consequences." Victor's mouth opened, but no words came. He had never seen her like this. Even at their worst moments, she had always been the supportive wife, the woman who stood beside him. But this? This was someone else. Someone who was willing to take down everything he had built. "I gave you everything, Jessica," he finally said, his voice breaking. "I gave you wealth, luxury, a life beyond your wildest dreams. And this is how you repay me?" "Repay you?" Jessica's voice was low but strong. "You think I owe you something for giving me money? For giving me a life that was nothing more than a gilded cage? You think I should be grateful for the years I spent walking beside a man who was never truly mine?" The room went quiet again. The tension was palpable. Jenna, who had been silent until now, couldn't take it any longer. "Enough," she shouted, standing up abruptly. "This is insane. You can't just destroy everything like this." Victor looked at her, his eyes desperate. "Jenna, please." But Jessica wasn't finished. "I didn't destroy anything, Jenna," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "You and Victor did that all on your own. I'm simply the one who's going to make sure the truth is known. The truth about how you used my trust, how you took my love and twisted it to serve your own selfish desires." Jenna's face twisted in anger. "You're just a bitter woman trying to get revenge. You don't even know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Jessica snapped. "You're nothing but a pawn in his game. And trust me, when I'm done, you'll see exactly how little he cares for you." Victor's face turned red, his frustration boiling over. He slammed his fist against the armrest of his chair. "Enough, Jessica. You don't know what you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Jessica said coldly. "I've known for a long time. And that's why I'm doing this. Because someone needs to stop you." Victor opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the witness stepped forward again. Her presence was commanding, drawing attention back to her. "Your Honor," she said, "there's more. Much more. Jessica may not have told you everything. But I can." The judge raised an eyebrow, motioning for the woman to continue. The witness looked directly at Jessica for a brief moment before turning back to the courtroom. "Jessica knew about the affair long before you thought. But what you didn't know, Victor, was that she also knew about the financial discrepancies." A murmur rippled through the room. Financial discrepancies? Victor's heart dropped. What was she talking about? Jessica's face remained neutral, but her mind was racing. She had kept that secret for so long. The money. The secret accounts. The money Victor had hidden away for years, away from prying eyes. It was all about control, all about the power he thought he could hold over her. "You lied to me, Victor," she said softly, but the words were a dagger. "You didn't just cheat on me. You took what was rightfully mine. You tried to strip me of everything, even the money that was supposed to be mine. The money you thought you could hide in secret accounts. But I found it. Victor's eyes darted around the room. His breath hitched in his throat. How did you know about that? Jessica didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the witness, who was still standing there, watching her with a quiet understanding. I knew because I had to dig deep. You left me no choice. Every time I asked, you lied. Every time I trusted you, you betrayed me. But there was one thing I could do. I could find the truth. Victor stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. He looked around the courtroom, his face twisted with anger. This is insane. You can't prove anything. You're just trying to ruin me. But the witness stepped forward, her voice firm. Actually, Victor, she can prove everything. And she has. Jessica's eyes burned with a cold fire. She wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. She had planned for this moment. She had set everything into motion, and now there was no turning back. I don't want to ruin you, Victor, she said, her voice calm but filled with an underlying strength. I just want you to face the consequences of your actions. She turned back to the witness, signaling for her to continue. The room was so still that it felt as though the world had stopped turning. I found the documents, the witness said, holding up a folder for all to see. I have everything you need to prove the financial fraud. The hidden accounts, the secret transfers, the money that Victor thought was out of reach. Victor's face had gone ashen. His legs felt like they might give out beneath him. He was drowning, and he knew it. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Jessica asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. Victor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jenna, who had been quiet until now, stood up, her face twisted in fury. This isn't over, Jessica. You think you've won? You've only just begun to make things worse for yourself. Jessica looked at Jenna, her eyes filled with sorrow more than anger. No, Jenna. This is over. For you, for Victor, and for all the lies. The judge banged his gavel, silencing the room. This trial will reconvene tomorrow. Everyone is adjourned for the day. Jessica took one last look at Victor. His empire, his carefully constructed life, was crumbling, piece by piece. And she was the one who had started the destruction. But she wasn't finished yet. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of what was to come pressed on her shoulders, but for the first time in years, she felt free. The courtroom was buzzing with chatter as the trial adjourned for the day. Reporters scrambled to capture the details of Jessica's shocking testimony, desperate for any morsel of information that would add to the scandal. Whispers and murmurs filled the air, but one voice cut through it all, the voice of Victor Harrow, now standing at the front of the courtroom, his face ashen, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. How did she find out? He muttered under his breath, his voice low but urgent. How did she know about the accounts? About the tapes? Jenna stood beside him, her face pale and tight with anxiety. She had expected some fallout from Jessica's testimony, but this? This was far beyond what they had prepared for. She had assumed that the affair was the worst of it, that they could spin a story of betrayal and move on, but Jessica had hit them where it hurt the most: financial deception, secret accounts, and now, the tapes. Jenna grabbed Victor's arm, her grip almost desperate. Victor, we need to act fast. If she's got those tapes, everything is over. She's got us cornered. Victor's mind was racing. The tapes. The recordings he thought were long gone, erased years ago after his affair with Jenna had begun. He had taken every precaution to make sure that nothing could come back to haunt him. But somehow, Jessica had outsmarted him, like always. He looked over at her, standing in the corner of the courtroom, her back straight, her posture unyielding. Jessica had become a force he didn't recognize, and the truth of it hit him harder than anything else. He had underestimated her. He had believed that his wealth, his power, his control over every part of their life would keep him untouchable. But now, she was the one in control. Jessica walked out of the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The events of the day had been overwhelming, and yet, she couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had played her cards well, revealing just enough to rattle Victor and Jenna without giving everything away. But she knew the next step was crucial. She had to keep the pressure on, keep the truth coming to light. She had always known that Victor's wealth wasn't earned honestly, but it wasn't until the last few months that she had started digging deeper. It had begun innocently enough, finding odd discrepancies in their joint accounts, a few missing transactions here and there. But then she found the tapes. Victor had thought he was clever, that his secret financial dealings were safe, hidden away from prying eyes. But Jessica had never been one to back down when something didn't sit right. And when she found the tapes, hidden in an old filing cabinet, beneath a pile of business documents, it was like the missing piece of the puzzle. They were recordings from meetings Victor had with various business partners, meetings where they discussed shady deals, offshore accounts, and, most importantly, ways to hide money from the government. The tapes had been the key to everything. With them, Jessica knew she could destroy him. She had watched them, listened to the lies and the manipulations, and it had sickened her. But she had also felt a strange sense of power, knowing that, at last, she had the leverage she needed. As Jessica made her way to her car, she couldn't help but replay the moments in the courtroom. The look on Victor's face when the tapes were mentioned. He had been truly scared, something she had never seen before. The fear in his eyes was a small victory, but she wasn't done yet. Victor, meanwhile, was trying to pull himself together. He had always been able to manage crises before, to spin the truth in his favor, but now he was cornered. His mind was consumed by one question: how could Jessica have gotten her hands on the tapes? He had been careful. He had made sure that all recordings, all documents that could potentially incriminate him, were destroyed. The tapes had been erased, or so he thought. But somehow, Jessica had found them. How? Victor, Jenna said, her voice low and urgent, pulling him from his thoughts. We need to go after her. We can't just sit here and wait for her to ruin us. Victor turned toward her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. I can't just go after her. She's got everything. The tapes. The financial documents. I can't stop her. But we can make her stop, Jenna insisted. We still have something she doesn't know about. Something we can use against her. Victor looked at Jenna, the glimmer of hope in his eyes. What are you talking about? Jenna hesitated for a moment before speaking. We still have the recording of Jessica. The one where she admits to knowing about the affair. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're talking about the one from the private investigator? Yes, Jenna confirmed. It's the only leverage we have left. If we play it right, we can turn this around. Victor's pulse quickened. The recording was old, but it could still be useful. He hadn't thought about it in years, but it could be the key to undermining Jessica's position in court. If they played their cards right, they could use it to discredit her, make her look like the one who had been dishonest all along. He grabbed Jenna's arm. We need to move fast. Get the recording. Get the investigator's report. I don't care what it takes. Meanwhile, Jessica was preparing for the next phase of her plan. She knew that Victor and Jenna would be scrambling, looking for ways to fight back. But she had the advantage now. She had the truth on her side. And nothing, not money, not power, not Victor's manipulative tactics, would stop her from exposing it. The next morning, as the trial resumed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jessica walked in with a quiet confidence. She was ready. Today, she would reveal the final piece of the puzzle. The judge called the court to order, and Jessica took her place once again. This time, the stakes were higher. She had made her move, and now it was time for Victor and Jenna to respond. Victor and Jenna were both in the front row, sitting together, their expressions grim. Victor was clearly on edge, but Jenna's eyes were darting nervously around the room, as if waiting for something to happen. The trial had already shifted in Jessica's favor, but today, everything was going to change. The witness, who had stood by Jessica's side in the previous session, was already waiting to take the stand again. Jessica motioned for her to approach. "Your Honor," Jessica began, her voice steady, "I would like to introduce one more piece of evidence. Something that will definitively prove the extent of Victor's deception." Victor's jaw clenched. He could feel the walls closing in around him. He knew this was it, the moment that would either make or break him. Jessica turned to the witness. "Please, play the tapes." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom as the audio filled the air. The recordings were clear, crisp, and damning. Victor's voice was unmistakable as he discussed the secret offshore accounts with his business partners, his calm demeanor as he spoke about manipulating the system. The tapes exposed everything, the lies, the deceit, and the lengths he had gone to hide his financial empire from the authorities. But then came the part that made Victor's heart race. The very last recording, the one where he spoke directly to Jessica, telling her that he had never loved her, that she was just a tool for his success. Jessica could feel the weight of the moment. She had never wanted it to come to this, but she knew it was the only way. She wasn't just exposing Victor, she was reclaiming her life. As the final words echoed through the courtroom, Victor's face went pale. He knew he had been caught. There was no escape now. Jenna's face twisted in fury as the tapes played on. She couldn't believe what was happening. Everything she had worked for, the relationship, the plans, was slipping through her fingers. The trial was far from over, but for the first time in months, Jessica felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: power. The truth was on her side, and no matter what Victor or Jenna did next, it was clear that the tides had shifted in her favor. And with that, the trap was set. Victor sat in his office, his fingers shaking slightly as he held the glass of whiskey. He had always prided himself on being a man who could control any situation, no matter how dire. Yet now, as the reality of his downfall settled in, he could hardly recognize the man he had become. His empire, carefully constructed over the years, was crumbling. His marriage to Jessica had been based on lies, and even his affair with Jenna had been built on a foundation of deceit. Now, it wasn't just his personal life at stake, it was his entire reputation, his wealth, his legacy. The truth had come crashing down on him like a tidal wave, and there was nothing left to do but try to salvage what little he could. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Victor didn't need to look up to know who it was. Jenna had been the one constant in his life during these turbulent times, but even her presence could no longer bring him the comfort it once did. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. Jenna entered the room, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were dark with worry, and her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides. "Victor, we need to talk. This is getting out of hand." Victor took a long sip of his drink, setting the glass down on the desk with a quiet thud. "I know," he muttered. "I've tried everything. But it's over. Jessica's got us cornered. She has the tapes, the accounts, the witnesses, everything. There's no way out." Jenna bit her lip, pacing in front of his desk. "You can't just give up like this, Victor. You still have options." "I don't have options," Victor snapped. "I've lost. The tapes are out. The truth is out. There's no turning back. I'll be lucky if I don't end up in prison." Jenna stopped pacing and looked at him, her expression hardening. "No. You're not going to lose. Not if I can help it." Victor looked up at her, his face filled with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "How? How can you help me? Everything's falling apart. Jessica has everything. The entire world is watching us. What else can we do? Jenna's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. There's one thing she doesn't have. One thing that could destroy her, Victor. One thing that will make everything she's done seem like a lie. Victor raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued despite himself. What are you talking about? Jenna took a step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. I have something Jessica doesn't know about. A secret that will turn the tables in our favor. It's a risk, but it could be our only shot. Victor leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. What is it? Jenna hesitated for a moment, as though weighing the decision in her mind. Finally, she spoke. I have another recording. A recording of Jessica. A conversation she had with someone very important. Victor's heart skipped a beat. What kind of conversation? Jenna paused, her expression unreadable. A conversation about her plans. Her intentions. The truth behind everything she's done to you. She's not the saint she's pretending to be, Victor. I've got proof that she's been manipulating the entire situation from the very beginning. Victor's eyes narrowed. You're sure about this? Jenna nodded. I'm sure. I've had it for months, but I wasn't sure when the right time to use it would be. Now, it's the only thing we have left. Victor sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. So you're telling me we have a chance? That we can turn this around? Jenna's lips pressed together tightly. We can, but we have to be careful. We can't just throw it out there. If we do this wrong, we could end up hurting ourselves more than her. Victor's mind was racing. If Jenna was right, and this recording could truly change everything, then they might have one last shot at salvaging their lives. But it was risky. It was dangerous. It could blow up in their faces, and they might lose everything. But then again, hadn't he already lost everything? I'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice low. Let's hear it. Let's see what we've got. Jenna nodded and reached into her bag, pulling out a small, unmarked flash drive. She slid it across the desk to Victor, who took it in his hands, feeling the weight of it. It was a lifeline, or it was a noose. He plugged the drive into his laptop and waited as the files loaded. The first file was titled simply, Jessica's Secret. Victor clicked on it, and the audio began to play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. It was Jessica's voice, but it wasn't the calm, collected tone she used in the courtroom. No, this was something different. It was a voice full of raw emotion, anger, frustration, and something darker, something that Victor couldn't quite place. The conversation began. I'm getting tired of this, you know. Tired of playing the game. Victor's getting too close to the edge. He'll break soon, and when he does, I'll be ready to take what's mine. I've been patient long enough. Victor's breath caught in his throat. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had been planning this. She had been manipulating him from the start, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The conversation continued, and Jessica's voice grew colder. I'll make sure he regrets ever thinking he could outsmart me. He doesn't know it yet, but this whole thing, the affair, the tapes, everything, was part of my plan. I've been setting him up for this fall from the very beginning. Victor sat frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. All these years, he had thought he had been in control, that he had been the one pulling the strings. But Jessica had been playing him all along. He had been the pawn in her game. The recording continued, Jessica's voice more sinister now. And as for Jenna, she's just a fool. A tool to get to Victor. Once I'm done with him, she'll be nothing. She won't even know what hit her. Victor's stomach turned. His mind raced, replaying the conversation over and over again. This was the proof they needed. This was the thing that could shatter Jessica's perfect image and expose her for the manipulative, ruthless woman she truly was. Jenna watched him carefully, her eyes never leaving his face as he listened to the recording. She knew how dangerous this was. She knew how easily it could backfire. But she also knew that they had no choice. Victor's face was unreadable as the recording ended. He sat in silence for several moments, his mind working furiously to process what he had just heard. Finally, he looked up at Jenna, his expression hard. "We're going to use this," he said, his voice determined. "We're going to turn the tables on Jessica once and for all." Jenna nodded slowly, but a flicker of doubt passed through her eyes. "We have to be careful, Victor. We can't just expose it without a plan. If Jessica finds out we have this, we're finished." "I know," Victor replied, his voice low. "But we have to act now. If we don't, we lose everything. This is our last shot." The following days were a blur of activity. Victor and Jenna worked tirelessly to prepare their next move. They met with lawyers, strategized every possible outcome, and carefully crafted a narrative that would paint Jessica as the mastermind behind everything. Victor knew this was his only chance. If they could expose Jessica for the manipulator she was, they could destroy her credibility and shift the focus back to her wrongdoing. But if they were too hasty, if they misjudged the situation, everything could come crashing down. Jessica had no idea what was coming. In the courtroom, Jessica sat silently, her eyes focused on the judge as the trial resumed. The tension in the air was thick, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers, all waiting for the next chapter in this high-profile battle. Victor and Jenna entered the courtroom, their faces tight with determination. They had made their decision. It was time to play their final card. The courtroom was tense as the trial continued, each day bringing new revelations, new twists, and more unanswered questions. The public was hanging on every word, the media amplifying every moment of the drama. But in the midst of all the chaos, Jessica was calm. She knew she had already won, even if she didn't yet know the full extent of the game Victor and Jenna were playing behind the scenes. Victor, for his part, was a man at war. The tapes had been his downfall, but the recording Jenna had revealed to him, Jessica's voice, cold and calculating, was his lifeline. It was all or nothing now. If they exposed Jessica's true nature, everything would change. He just had to make sure they played it right. One wrong move, and they could lose everything. It was late in the evening when Victor met with his legal team, the air thick with anticipation. Jenna was sitting across from him, her face pale and drawn. But her eyes were sharp. She was still holding on to the belief that this was their final shot at redemption. But Victor knew better. There was no going back after this. The choice they were about to make would either save them or destroy them. "So, what's the plan?" Victor asked, leaning forward. His eyes were filled with determination, but also a hint of doubt. He knew the risks, but he also knew there was no other way out. His lead attorney, Gregory, glanced at the stack of papers in front of him before speaking. "We've reviewed the tapes, Victor. Jessica's voice is clear, and the content of the conversation is damning. But before we release it in court, we need to ensure we have a solid legal strategy. If we move too fast, she could counterattack and accuse us of tampering with evidence." Jenna's fingers drummed nervously on the table. "We don't have time for a slow play. If we don't act now, Jessica will have us right where she wants us. We need to expose her before she has a chance to turn the tables again." Gregory raised his hands in a gesture of caution. "I agree. But we need to be strategic. We'll need a compelling narrative to present with the tapes, something that positions Jessica as the mastermind behind the entire ordeal. It's not just about the tapes, it's about framing the story in a way that the jury and the public will believe." Victor clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. "I don't care about the public. I care about winning. We've lost so much already. I can't afford to lose again. Jenna leaned forward, her voice low but insistent. We'll make sure it works. I know exactly how to turn this around. Just trust me. Victor stared at her, his gaze intense. He wanted to trust her. He had trusted her before, and she had been right. But now, with everything on the line, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a razor's edge. We'll go through it again, Gregory said, breaking the silence. If we're going to present this in court tomorrow, we need to ensure every detail is airtight. We cannot afford any mistakes. The night wore on as they meticulously reviewed the evidence, the strategy, and the risks. Each step was weighed with care, but the underlying tension remained. Victor knew that this would be the last time they could play their cards. After tomorrow, there would be no turning back. The following morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. The press had caught wind of a new development, and speculation was rife. Jessica entered with her usual poise, her face calm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. She had no idea what was coming. But Victor and Jenna did. This was their moment. As the judge called the court to order, the silence in the room was almost suffocating. Victor and Jenna were seated at the plaintiff's table, their expressions carefully controlled, but beneath the surface, the anxiety was palpable. They had one chance to expose Jessica for what she was, and it had to work. Jessica's lawyer stood and called their first witness, a character witness who had been involved in Jessica's charity work. As the witness began to speak, Jessica glanced over at Victor, a faint smirk on her lips. She was confident. Too confident. But Victor wasn't about to let her win this time. When the time came, Gregory stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, we would like to introduce a new piece of evidence, an audio recording that directly contradicts the narrative Ms. Harrow has presented throughout this trial. There was a murmur in the courtroom as all eyes turned to the defense table. Jessica's face went pale, but she quickly composed herself, her eyes narrowing. She had no idea what was about to hit her. Gregory continued, this recording is of a conversation between Ms. Harrow and an unidentified individual. In it, Ms. Harrow admits to orchestrating the entire affair, manipulating her husband, and using him as a pawn in her larger plan. The tension in the room was electric as the prosecution began setting up the audio. Jessica's lawyer stood, ready to object, but the judge raised a hand, signaling for them to proceed. As the recording played, Jessica's voice filled the courtroom. She sounded cold, calculating, and detached, none of the warmth or vulnerability that she had shown in public. The contrast was striking. Victor listened intently as Jessica's voice echoed through the speakers. I've been setting him up for years. All these moves with the money, the affairs, it's all part of my plan. He'll break, and when he does, I'll be ready to take everything. Victor doesn't even know I've been playing him. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The weight of Jessica's words was impossible to ignore. The audience was stunned into silence, but Jessica's face had turned a deep shade of crimson. She didn't flinch, but the anger in her eyes was unmistakable. The recording continued, revealing her chilling disregard for her own actions. Jenna? She's just a pawn. She's nothing compared to what I've built. Once I've taken Victor down, I'll be rid of her too. As the last words of the recording faded, the room was silent. Every eye was fixed on Jessica, who was now visibly shaken. She had been caught in a lie, caught in her own words, and caught in a web of manipulation she could no longer deny. Victor's pulse raced as he watched her reaction. This was it. This was the moment that would change everything. Gregory stood, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, this evidence shows not only that Ms. Harrow manipulated her husband for her own financial gain, but also that she orchestrated the affair and has been lying to the public and the court throughout these proceedings. She is not the victim here, she is the perpetrator. Jessica's lawyer jumped to his feet, trying to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp gesture. Ms. Harrow, I believe you owe the court an explanation. The courtroom erupted into whispers, but Jessica remained silent, her jaw clenched tightly. She had never thought it would come to this. She had believed that she could outsmart Victor, that she could manipulate the truth to her advantage. But now, the truth was out, and there was nowhere to hide. The following days were a blur of legal maneuvering, public backlash, and mounting pressure. Jessica's reputation, once pristine, was in tatters. The public, the media, and even her closest friends had turned against her. The trial was far from over, but the damage had been done. Victor and Jenna sat together in a quiet corner of the courtroom, watching as the prosecution prepared their closing statements. There was a sense of finality in the air, as though everything was about to come to a head. "I can't believe it's finally happening," Jenna whispered. "We've done it. We've exposed her." Victor's eyes were focused, his expression hard. "We've exposed her, but the real battle is yet to come. The court of public opinion is still out there, and that's the one we can't control." Jenna nodded. "We'll have to live with whatever happens next. But at least we've won. She can't take that from us." Victor glanced over at Jessica, who was sitting across the room, her face pale and drawn. Her empire had crumbled, and there was nothing left for her but the wreckage she had created. But even as he looked at her, Victor felt a strange sense of sadness. She had been his wife, the woman he had once loved, and now she was a broken shell of the person she had been. As the final verdict was announced, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Jessica was convicted of financial fraud, manipulation, and conspiracy. The sentence was harsh, but the damage to her public image was irreparable. She would never recover from this scandal, no matter how hard she tried. Victor and Jenna had won. But the cost of victory was far higher than they had anticipated. Consequences. The aftermath of the trial had left a city in shock. The sensational case that had captivated public attention for months was now drawing to a close. Jessica Harrow, once a symbol of wealth, grace, and power, had been stripped of her illusions. Her public downfall had played out like a real-life soap opera, but for those who had lived it, the players at the heart of the story, the aftermath was far from glamorous. For Victor, Jenna, and Jessica, the days that followed would test their resilience, their moral compass, and their understanding of what truly mattered in the wake of their destruction. The rebuilding of Victor. Victor had always considered himself a man of control. He had built his empire from the ground up, accumulating wealth and power, always a few steps ahead of everyone else. But in the wake of Jessica's betrayal and the public humiliation that followed, he found himself adrift. The weight of everything that had transpired was crushing him. He had lost his marriage, his reputation, and nearly his entire fortune. What had once seemed like a secure, predictable life now felt like a fragile house of cards. He spent his days holed up in his penthouse, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, trying to put his business affairs in order. His legal team had advised him to stay out of the public eye, but that was easier said than done. The press had followed him like vultures, circling his every move. Everywhere he went, he was reminded of the wreckage his life had become. Yet, there was a part of him that understood why things had gone the way they had. For years, he had been blinded by his ambition, by his need to control everything around him. He had ignored the signs, Jessica's coldness, the cracks in their marriage, the lies that had built up between them. He had convinced himself that as long as he maintained his image, as long as he stayed ahead of the game, everything would work out. But he had been wrong. Now, as he stared out of his office window, watching the city skyline stretch out before him, he realized that he had to rebuild, not just his business, but his life. He had lost his sense of self in the pursuit of wealth and power. Perhaps now was the time to find something more meaningful. It was a hard realization, one that came with a bitter taste. He couldn't go back to who he had been before, but he could choose to change. He could choose to leave behind the hollow pursuit of money and focus on rebuilding the relationships that had been damaged along the way. But there was one relationship that remained uncertain, Jenna. Jenna's quiet struggle. Jenna had never imagined that the aftermath of her decision to help Victor would be so complicated. At first, everything had seemed so clear-cut. She had felt vindicated, like a woman who had fought against the system and won. But now, with the dust settling, she found herself grappling with questions she hadn't anticipated. She had helped bring down Jessica Harrow, a woman who had wronged Victor in the most manipulative of ways. The satisfaction of exposing Jessica's lies had been fleeting, replaced by an uncomfortable emptiness. Jenna hadn't just been part of a victory, she had been part of the destruction of a family. A family that had, in its own way, tried to love her. Despite everything, Jenna couldn't shake the guilt that had begun to gnaw at her. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was in the right, that her actions had been justified. But now, as the weeks passed and she found herself alone more often than not, the loneliness crept in. Victor's company had grown quiet. The staff who had once admired him now eyed him with suspicion, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Jenna, too, was left on the sidelines, watching as Victor wrestled with his own demons. She had given him everything, her loyalty, her trust, even her love. And yet, she felt invisible. She wasn't the woman who had brought down a powerful figure anymore, she was simply a bystander to a mess she had created. She missed the excitement, the rush of the courtroom, the adrenaline of the game. But now, all she felt was uncertainty. The life she had imagined for herself with Victor, the life of luxury and power, now felt meaningless. She had always wanted something more, but she wasn't sure what that more was anymore. Jenna's thoughts drifted to the day of the trial, the moment when she had seen the look in Victor's eyes as he had realized the full extent of Jessica's betrayal. It had been a look of quiet devastation, of a man who had finally seen the truth about the woman he had loved for so many years. And yet, despite everything that had happened, she had hoped for more, hoped that the man she had fought for would finally acknowledge her. But as the days went on, Jenna realized that Victor's focus was elsewhere. He was consumed by the rebuilding of his business, the salvage of what was left of his life. The truth was, he didn't need her anymore. And maybe, deep down, she knew it was for the best. Jenna's mind drifted to the future, to a life that didn't involve Victor. For the first time in a long time, she entertained the possibility of a different path, one where she could be free of the weight of the past. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was becoming clearer with each passing day. Jessica's downfall and the quiet consequences. Jessica's downfall had been swift and brutal. Once the press got hold of the tapes and her manipulative behavior was exposed for the world to see, her life unraveled. The once powerful businesswoman had been forced to relinquish control of her empire, her assets frozen by a series of court orders. Her name, once synonymous with luxury and sophistication, became a symbol of deceit and betrayal. But what hurt Jessica the most was not the financial loss or the public disgrace. It was the fact that she had lost the one thing that had kept her going for so long, the sense of control. For years, she had manipulated the people around her, pulling strings and playing games. She had thought she was untouchable, that she could outsmart everyone. But in the end, it was her own arrogance and pride that had led to her downfall. Her prison was not made of bars or concrete, it was the weight of her own actions, the constant reminders of the relationships she had destroyed. She had spent years building her empire, but in the end, it had all come crashing down. And no amount of money, no amount of power, could fix the damage she had done. She tried to rebuild, but the public didn't want her back. No one wanted to work with the woman who had destroyed so many lives for her own gain. Her former friends turned their backs on her, her family distanced themselves, and she was left alone in a cold, empty mansion, surrounded by the wealth she had worked so hard to amass, but no longer able to enjoy it.